Metal jaws snapped onto her tires the instant she stepped outside, all because she dared grow tomatoes in her driveway. The HOA president sneered viciously while a dumbfounded officer gawked at the spike strips. They did this over vegetables? He spat, still in shock. But she had unearthed a 1992 legal clause buried deep within the neighborhood's founding documents, a clause poised to turn this trivial HOA skirmish into a raging revolution. Sometimes tomatoes aren't mere food, they're incendiary weapons. The cursed $7 tomato salad that shattered my life arrived on the same day as a pink slip from my accounting firm, leaving my final paycheck woefully short of next month's mortgage. Anxiety twisted through my gut as I stared at a receipt for yet another overpriced salad. That night, fueled by grim determination and desperation, I tore open my driveway, lined it with rows of cheap plastic planters from Home Depot, and planted tomato seedlings, peppers, and herbs. It was the only way I could claw back some money while still feeding myself. The very next day, under a blistering sun that broiled everything in its path, my planters stood defiantly. My driveway received 6 glorious hours of relentless light, a perfect blessing. Curious neighbors came over, dripping with both sympathy and encouragement. Mr. Garcia, living right next door, handed over a few extra tomato cages he'd rescued from his cluttered garage. Squinting as he scanned the HOA letter I'd just begun to show him, he murmured, "Maple Creek Estates was once Henderson Farm, you know. Old man Henderson would have worshipped your tomatoes if the developers hadn't wiped him off the map." His half-smile was laced with bitterness. There might even be an official nod to that farmland in the records. I waved away his comment as mere nostalgia while I clung to the hope that my tomatoes could slash my bloated grocery bill. My very first meager harvest saved me a staggering $43 on produce. In the shadow of unemployment and piling bills, that slim victory felt explosive. Little did I know it was the spark destined to ignite a brutal standoff with the neighborhood's most formidable power brokers. Across the street, Patricia Davis stood like a statue, her phone capturing every angle of my defiant planters. Her blonde bob remained eerily still, unmoved even by the restless wind. I offered a tentative wave. "Beautiful day, huh?" she replied coolly, lowering her phone just enough to cast a frosty smile my way. "You really think rotting vegetables are going to impress buyers? My sister's a realtor. She said your farm just cost me at least $50,000 in equity." I blinked in disbelief. "They're not rotting," I protested. "They're perfectly healthy." But before I could finish, Patricia turned away. By dusk, a curt email from Richard Thompson, our tyrannical HOA president, buzzed in my inbox. He cited multiple concerns about my so-called agricultural activities in a residential zone and threatened escalating consequences if I didn't dismantle the planters in 7 days. Frenzied, I rifled through our HOA handbook, memorizing every ambiguous regulation. Nowhere did it explicitly forbid growing vegetables in containers. Section 15, Clause 3, merely stated that long-term storage on driveways was prohibited, referring to decrepit vehicles, rusted tools, or accumulations of junk, not thriving living plants that I nurtured every day. When I opened my mailbox the next morning, a handwritten note fell out. Gardens belong in backyards, not on display for the entire neighborhood. The looping cursive matched Patricia's handwriting from the previous year's Christmas card. Immediately, I felt my blood pressure spike. I tried to be polite, but her motives were crystal clear. She considered my small garden an insult to her curated perfection. Over coffee, Mr. Garcia leaned in, voice subdued. "This is typical Patricia. She's always aiming for the Neighborhood Beautification Award. Your tomatoes don't fit her idea of manicured." He shrugged. "And Richard's best friends with her husband. They golf every Sunday. They've run people out of here before. The Johnsons left after the HOA fined them for their daughter's wheelchair ramp having the wrong shade of beige." I knew enough to see this was no idle threat, but I still hoped reason would prevail. I drafted a response letter highlighting the county definition of landscaping, which specifically permitted container gardens. Then I attached pictures of other small rule violations around the neighborhood. Holiday decorations left up too long, wind chimes, lawn gnomes. None of those garnered official complaints. It was selective enforcement, and I pointed that out. For 3 days, I heard nothing. Then early on a Saturday, I got a heavy envelope taped to my door. The letter inside ordered me to remove my unauthorized container farm within 72 hours or face a $100 daily fine. I considered ignoring it until I glanced at my meager checking account balance. $100 a day would bury me. I kept telling myself I had the law on my side, but Patricia escalated. One afternoon, I came home from a quick grocery run to find my planters knocked over, soil everywhere. My security camera, installed after the first ominous note, caught the culprits. Patricia's teenage son Tyler and two of his friends. They kicked over a few large plastic tubs and cheered as tomatoes and peppers toppled. One voice rang out clearly, "Mom says these need to go!" I wanted to scream. Instead, I called the police. Officer Davis arrived, looking uncomfortable. "HOA disputes tend to be civil matters," he began, "but this is vandalism." He took a look at the security footage and asked if I wanted to press charges. I hesitated. "Not yet. Let's just document it. But if they do anything else, I'm done playing nice." The next day, I confronted Patricia in her driveway. She wore white tennis clothes and gardening gloves, though her lawn was flawless with no sign of actual gardening. "I have video of Tyler destroying my planters," I told her, forcing my voice to stay even. "That's trespassing and vandalism." Her expression hardened, though she kept her voice low. "Don't threaten my son. You're the one causing a public nuisance, attracting pests, lowering property values. That's what the HOA is trying to prevent." I nearly laughed. "Lowering property values? In this market? It's not funny," Patricia snapped. "We gave you warnings. If you continue this, you leave us no choice but to enforce the rules. Check your mailbox." Sure enough, the next official letter arrived that evening. A final demand to remove the agricultural implements within 48 hours or face fines. They'd all signed it, Richard, Patricia, and 3 other board members I barely knew. The next morning, I got a frantic knock on my door. Dave, who lived 3 houses down, waved a bright orange paper at me. "They hit me with a violation for my basketball hoop," he said in disbelief. "It's been there for 4 years. No one ever complained." He wasn't alone. I found several more neighbors with brand new violation notices for everything from bird feeders to a decorative windmill to unapproved rose bushes. Dave scowled. "They're punishing anyone who ever said a kind word about your garden." Sophia from next door joined us. Patricia bragged at book club that she'd start with the farm problem, meaning you, and clean up everyone else after. She and Richard have total control. Everyone's afraid to speak up. That night, I invited the neighbors over. 8 people came, each bearing stories of petty infractions, fines, or threats from Richard and Patricia. It felt like a miniature rebellion forming in my living room. "We should all show up at the next HOA meeting," I said, "and call them out together." There were nods all around, strength in numbers. I also made it my mission to research selective enforcement laws for HOAs. I gathered photos, dated them, and wrote detailed notes. If we were going to beat them, we had to be thorough. When Monday morning rolled around, a landscaping truck rumbled up to my driveway. 2 men in uniforms got out explaining they had an HOA work order to remove my planters. I politely told them if they touched my property, I'd call the police for destruction of private property. They left, looking unsure. But within an hour, I got a scathing email from Richard about my continued defiance. That afternoon, I noticed Patricia strolling the neighborhood with 3 other impeccably dressed women pointing at various houses. When they reached mine, Patricia practically performed a dramatic flourish. "And here," I heard her say, "is our local farmland." The women shook their heads in synchronized disapproval. I'd had enough. I called the county housing authority, hoping they could provide guidance. A clerk named Marcus listened to my story, exhaling in sympathy. "They can't just violate county ordinances," he said. "And some developments here have old farmland protection clauses from decades ago. You should check the original community covenants if your property sits on land once zoned for agriculture." Old farmland protection? My mind replayed what Mr. Garcia had said. That night, I drove to the county records office, rummaging through dusty files until closing time. At last, I found something in the original 1992 Maple Creek Estates development plan. Section 8 was short but eye-opening. In accordance with the County Agricultural Heritage Protection Act, all homeowners in Maple Creek Estates retain the right to cultivate food-producing plants on their property, provided such cultivation does not create hazardous conditions. I took pictures of that entire document, heart pounding. I had no idea if it would help me keep my garden, but it certainly contradicted the HOA's claims. When I got home, the planters I'd painstakingly reset were doused in some foul-smelling bleach. The leaves wilted, turning brown on contact. My eyes burned from the fumes. As I stood there shaking, Patricia drove by slowly, smiling in that icy way she had, as if she were proud of the damage. I didn't realize chemical sabotage was just the beginning. Early the next morning, scraping metal sounds jolted me awake. I rushed outside and nearly dropped my coffee mug at the site. Two men in bright yellow Maple Creek maintenance vests were drilling strips of metal with sharp spikes on both sides of my driveway. "Hey!" I shouted, racing over. "Stop it!" They paused, startled, but the older one shrugged. "We're just following HOA orders, ma'am. Nothing personal. These are property demarcation devices to indicate a violation zone." "Property demarcation?" I repeated, incredulous. "They're spike strips like the police use to stop criminals. You're basically trapping me." The younger worker averted his eyes. "If you drive over them, your tires will get shredded," he admitted. I called the police again, furious. Officer Martinez arrived, studied the strips, and shook his head. "Look, I get why you're upset, but HOAs often have broad authority under community covenants. This might be a civil issue." "Civil issue? They're holding my car hostage," I exclaimed. "How am I supposed to go anywhere without destroying my tires?" He frowned sympathetically. "I suggest contacting the HOA board to remove them or negotiating compliance." "I'm sorry." Negotiate compliance, as if I were the unreasonable one. I stomped across the street intending to confront Richard directly, but Patricia stepped into my path, phone in hand, clearly recording. Well, if it isn't Maple Creek's own Farmer Jones," she said with a smirk. "Quite the predicament with those spike strips." "This is illegal," I seethed. "You can't detain someone on their own property." Patricia shook her head. "You were given multiple warnings to remove the planters. Now you're stuck. Remove them and the HOA can remove the spikes. Simple." Richard appeared behind her, arms crossed. "We've had complaints from 7 different homeowners about your rotting produce. This isn't personal." But Patricia couldn't resist adding, "Maybe you can grow enough to feed yourself now that you can't drive to the grocery store." My mind whirled with rage and desperation. I had a doctor's appointment soon, and I needed to pick up my mother from physical therapy. Instead, I ended up borrowing my neighbor Ellie's car, carefully steering my riding lawnmower around the spikes to get off my driveway. I drove straight to the county records office, again, and spent another 3 hours confirming every detail of that farmland clause. If the HOA's new rules contradicted the original covenant, maybe I had a fighting chance. What I discovered set my heart racing. The Maple Creek Estates developer had explicitly promised to preserve agricultural rights when they purchased the Henderson farm. That promise was part of the property deed, meaning the HOA couldn't override it. The next morning, I called Sarah Jenkins, a property rights lawyer recommended by the clerk at the records office. I barely got 3 sentences into my story before she let out an incredulous laugh. "Spike strips? I've seen some wild HOA battles, but that's a new one." I brought her all the documents I'd compiled. She flipped through them, occasionally letting out little exclamations of disbelief. "This is huge," she said. "The Maple Creek developer left in a farmland protection clause under the county's Agricultural Heritage Act of 1992. That predates the HOA bylaws by years. They can't legally force you to remove your vegetable garden. In fact, it's specially protected." My shoulders sagged in relief. "But what about the spike strips?" Sarah's brows knitted. "That could be seen as unlawful detainment or harassment. We can file an emergency injunction." By noon, she'd prepared the paperwork. I felt lightheaded from the adrenaline rush. Just to be safe, I posted a single photo of the spike strips on our neighborhood's online forum with a question. "Is this how an HOA should handle a vegetable garden dispute?" The post exploded. Residents I'd never even met commented in outrage, sharing their own stories of petty fines. Within hours, local news channels reached out to me. By mid-afternoon, I had a reporter from Channel 7 on my doorstep. I was explaining how the spike strips had trapped my vehicle when a black SUV screeched to a halt across the street. Patricia jumped out, with Richard right behind. The reporter's eyes lit up, sensing drama. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Davis, the reporter called, microphone at the ready. Did you authorize the installation of these tire-puncturing devices? Patricia pushed forward, ignoring the camera. She's violating community standards, she snapped, pointing at my neat rows of planters. We had every right to enforce compliance. Those planters are feeding me, I said, trying to remain calm. Nothing in the HOA handbook says I can't have container gardens. Richard glared at the cameraman. Turn off the camera. This is a private neighborhood matter. The reporter merely signaled the cameraman to keep rolling. We're just reporting on a story of public interest, she said. Patricia and Richard stormed up my walkway once the reporter concluded her segment. Patricia's nails practically sparkled with anger. You made us look like monsters, she hissed. I stared back at her. You installed spike strips around my car. How else would that look? Richard stepped between us, lowering his voice in an attempt to sound authoritative. Look, we can solve this quietly. Remove the garden. We'll remove the strips. No fuss, no lawyers, no media circus. I pulled out a photocopy of the farmland clause. Here's my counteroffer. You remove the strips immediately, or I proceed with the lawsuit. You're violating my protected agricultural rights, not to mention false imprisonment. Take your pick. They read it, eyes widening at the official 1992 date. Patricia turned pale, then red. Richard tore the paper in half. Our HOA has a $300,000 legal fund. We'll see if your so-called loophole stands up in court. I clutched the torn halves, heart pounding, but I tried to look unruffled. We'll see, I repeated. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even though Sarah was optimistic, I dreaded the possibility of a lengthy lawsuit. Richard was right. They had far deeper pockets than I did. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a security alert. I groggily checked the feed from my front yard camera. My eyes widened. Tom Davis, Patricia's husband, was hunched by my planters with a pair of garden shears, systematically snipping through the irrigation lines I'd just replaced. He then slashed the spare soil bags I kept to top up the containers. I called the police immediately. This time, they arrived in minutes and caught Tom red-handed. Patricia tried to appear outraged when she rushed outside in a silk robe, claiming her husband was checking for rats. But Officer Martinez held up the garden shears. With these, ma'am? Tom was taken in for questioning. I noticed, through my own exhaustion, that a few neighbors were peeking from behind curtains. Dave even gave me a discreet thumbs up from across the street. By dawn, I got an email from Sarah. The judge had scheduled an emergency hearing for that morning. I barely had time to dress nicely before heading to the courthouse, heart thumping so hard I felt dizzy. Sarah was calm, flipping through her meticulously prepared folders. We entered the courtroom and there they were, Richard, Patricia, and a sleek-suited lawyer who whispered constantly in Richard's ear. To my astonishment, more than 20 neighbors filled the seats behind me. Some of them I'd never even met. A few waved encouragingly when I looked around. Judge Watkins entered, and everyone rose. She fixed a stern gaze on the room. I reviewed the evidence late into the night, and I have serious concerns about what I've seen. Richard's lawyer stood. Your Honor, if I may... She cut him off with a raised hand. Mr. Parker, I read your brief. Now, I'd like to see the photographic evidence of these spike strips. The screens in the courtroom displayed the photos I'd taken. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Thompson, she said, did you or did you not authorize the installation of these metal devices? Richard cleared his throat. Your Honor, yes. But they were simply property markers to indicate an ongoing violation. We never intended property markers? The judge looked incredulous. They're marketed as vehicle deterrent spike systems designed to shred tires. Did you intend to prevent Ms. Walker from leaving her driveway? Richard hesitated. Patricia suddenly stood, ignoring her lawyer's hiss. We warned her multiple times, but she refused to follow our community standards, so... The judge banged her gavel. Mrs. Davis, you are not recognized to speak. Sit down. Sarah stepped forward, presenting the farmland clause from 1992. This predates any HOA bylaws by 4 years, she explained, handing copies to the judge. Maple Creek Estates was once Henderson Farm, and the developers agreed to respect agricultural usage. That can't be undone by later community rules. Richard's lawyer attempted to argue that modern beautification standards superseded outdated covenants, but the judge remained unimpressed. "This covenant language is explicit," she said, tapping the page. "I see no exemption or termination clause." Then Sarah showed the security footage of Tom Davis slashing my irrigation lines. The judge's eyebrows climbed even higher. "Mr. Davis has been charged with vandalism. Is that correct?" Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. He admitted he was acting on a request to fix the garden situation." It took only 40 minutes for the judge to deliver a decision. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff," she declared. "The Maple Creek Estates HOA violated a protected property right. Additionally, installing physical barriers to prevent Ms. Walker from using her vehicle constitutes unlawful detainment. This behavior is nothing short of vigilantism." She turned a sharp gaze on Richard and Patricia. "The HOA is ordered to remove all spike strips immediately. The plaintiff is awarded $155,000 in damages, plus reimbursement of all legal fees and repair costs for vandalized property." Patricia made a strangled sound. Richard gripped the edge of the table, face paling. The judge concluded, "I am also mandating a new HOA board election within 30 days, overseen by a court-appointed observer. Should any further harassment occur, I won't hesitate to hold the responsible parties in contempt. Clear?" They nodded, silent and shell-shocked. The gavel came down. I felt all the tension I'd been holding dissolve in one giant wave. Sarah gave my shoulder a triumphant squeeze. "We did it," she whispered. Outside, nearly everyone from my block was waiting. They burst into cheers when they saw me. Dave grinned. "We watched the hearing live stream. You nailed them." As promised, the spike strips were ripped out that same afternoon. The maintenance crew completed the removal under the supervision of a police officer, though they looked as if they'd rather be anywhere else. Ellie presented me with a ceramic planter painted with sunflowers. "For our neighborhood's defender," she said. Tears blurred my vision. The ripple effect began almost immediately. Richard resigned from the HOA board within a week. He soon listed his house for sale, apparently eager to leave behind the community he'd once controlled. Patricia stayed, but she rarely showed her face. The new board members, including Dave, Mrs. Johnson, and even Mr. Garcia, voted to create a neighborhood community garden. An unused patch of land behind the playground was suddenly buzzing with people digging raised beds and planting vegetables, fruit trees, and herbs. Tom Davis, ironically, completed his community service hours by helping build those raised beds. Despite everything, the man had real carpentry skills when not slashing irrigation lines at 2 in the morning. Even more surprising, I started receiving visits from people outside Maple Creek. A woman from Oakwood Ridge told me she'd been fined for a small backyard greenhouse. "Your case is legendary," she said. "We heard about it on local news. I just want to know what our real rights are." I showed her the farmland clause, explained how I tracked down the original property records, and advised her to do the same. She left determined to fight her own battles. 3 months later, the County Planning Commission invited me to speak at a panel on urban agriculture rights. "You're practically a local celebrity," the commissioner told me with a smile. "Your case against Maple Creek Estates changed the way people see these HOA disputes." Standing at that podium, I recalled how humiliating it felt to discover spike strips around my car just for growing tomatoes. At the end of my speech, I added, "They called it a loophole. I call it justice." But when other neighborhoods started adopting what some folks are calling tomato laws, that's when I realized my driveway wasn't just growing vegetables. It was growing hope. Or was it just inviting trouble? I went home that evening to water my plants, feeling both proud and apprehensive. My driveway garden was thriving again, with bright red tomatoes dangling like ornaments. The kids who once stared at it with curiosity now helped harvest cucumbers and peppers, which filled me with joy but also a nagging worry about what might go wrong. A few neighbors had their own container gardens too, and some days I spotted them exchanging produce, turning the street into a friendly bartering zone. But was this sense of community strong enough to withstand any backlash? Patricia rarely spoke to me anymore, and she still refused to acknowledge the success of the new community garden, which left me uncertain about how to feel. Her husband quietly apologized one day while hammering together the last of the raised beds for his court-ordered hours. "I'm sorry," Tom mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Never thought it'd blow up like this." His words hung in the air, and I just nodded, letting him work. Part of me wanted to yell, but another part felt more relieved than angry. Was this the right resolution, or was I letting go too easily? The real victory wasn't punishing the people who caused me grief, but freeing the entire neighborhood from their intimidation tactics, or so I told myself. Every time I see faint marks on my driveway where the spike strips once were, I'm reminded of how close I came to giving in. I nearly abandoned my garden, but that single, seemingly insignificant right to grow my own food held so much power. By challenging an overreaching HOA, we ended up transforming Maple Creek Estates for the better, bringing neighbors closer, and inspiring other communities to reclaim their own rights. But I still wondered if we were prepared for any future challenges. This morning, my phone lit up with a text from Sarah. "The state legislature is reviewing the Homeowner Food Freedom Act, citing our case as an example." I couldn't stop smiling, yet I also couldn't shake off the anxiety. I'd once wondered if standing my ground was worth the stress. Now I knew it was, or at least, I hoped it was. Sometimes you plant a seed to feed yourself for a day. Sometimes you grow something bigger, a movement, a change that protects your neighbors. But I still questioned whether it was enough. It all started because one small garden made Patricia Davis so angry, she never thought to check the law that had been there all along. But what if that anger resurfaces in other ways? As my grandfather used to say, before you dig up someone else's garden, you'd better know whose land you're really standing on. But did we truly know? Or were we just hoping for the best?